Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. If you are in the business of selling homes, you have got to pay attention to what I'm about to say. And I'm saying it really fast because I don't want to lose your attention before I get it out. Do not let sellers retain possession after closing. The law in Washington state has changed. It is extraordinarily dangerous, buyer brokers, for your buyer to allow a seller to retain possession after closing. I am so grateful today to be joined by Kaitlyn Jackson with Dimension Law Group. I'll let her introduce herself well, you'll understand when she's going to get to introduce herself here in a second. Kaitlyn called me a few days ago and said, Annie, your industry has a huge problem. Buyer brokers are allowing sellers, or buyers are allowing sellers to retain possession after closing, and Washington law has changed in such a way that this is her talking, I am currently representing buyers whose seller was supposed to move out some reasonable number of days after closing. Seller didn't move out. It is now nearly impossible. I'm not exaggerating. Is that hyperbole, Kaitlyn? Nearly impossible to get them out.
Depends on why you bought the property, but it could be, yeah.
Yeah. Lawyers are being paid tens of thousands of dollars across the state on a case-by-case basis, collectively, I'm sure hundreds of thousands of dollars, to help buyers get sellers out of the house. Even though sellers said they were going to move 3 days after closing, 8 days after closing, 2 months after closing, it doesn't really matter. If they choose not to move out, buyer's stuck with them, unless buyer spends an enormous amount of time, a huge amount of attorney fees, and life-consuming energy, because that's what litigation is all about. Why am I being so super scary in this video? Well, all I can say is I'm not exaggerating. So, Kaitlyn, give us a real quick nutshell, if you will, of your background so that people know that you're the real deal, and then just tell the camera what you told me when you called me about the risk factors that you're seeing.
Right. Okay, so my name is Kaitlyn Jackson. I'm an attorney for Dimension Law Group. I'm also on the board for the Rental Housing Association of Washington. I myself am not only just a landlord-tenant attorney, but I am also a landlord. So this area I pay very, very close attention to, not just from a professional standpoint, but from a personal standpoint. And this year, as of April, May-ish of 2021, when our legislature called it a day, there were a lot of significant changes to landlord-tenant law that are very, very broadly applied in our state. One of the biggest changes was what we call a just cause statewide ordinance, which means that for many types of tenancies, particularly tenancies that are for less than 6 months or less than a year under some circumstances, they are not terminable for any reason, just any reason by the landlord. They are terminable by the tenant only, unless you have specific reasons why. And for many buyers of properties who've rented the property back to the previous owner for some certain amount of time, may not have one of those pre-approved reasons for terminating that tenancy, because it will not expire on its own terms as it used to prior to these new law changes.
The rental agreement that you created, it will expire. Please understand what Kaitlyn just said. The rental agreement will expire, but the tenants, AKA the sellers, right to occupy the property does not expire just because the rental agreement expires. Is that right?
It's exactly correct. Yep.
Okay. So Kaitlyn and I have been talking about this because she's been educating me. I'm going to tell you that there is a very small handful of lawyers in this state who are now competent to practice landlord-tenant law. I am not among that very small group. Kaitlyn is. And so she was just educating me about all of the many aspects of this. And folks, these are not little technical, just interesting to lawyer type nuances. These are fundamental, nuts and bolts, impactful issues if the seller is going to retain possession after closing. It's not realistic to cover this in a video, in a Friday video. And so this is your teaser video to let you know that if there's any chance that you are going to represent a buyer who might let a seller retain possession after closing, you should listen to the podcast that's linked. Because Kaitlyn and I are going to explain in the podcast, I'm going to ask questions. Kaitlyn's going to explain in the podcast, webcast, the full breadth of this issue. And I will tell you, I'm going to cut to the punch on one thing, which maybe what you'd like to know is, so what do we do then? What's realistic? What's the workaround? I'm going to tell you that my answer is there is no workaround. Don't buyers, you shouldn't let sellers retain possession after closing. I'm sorry if that seems super harsh and maybe even unworkable in your opinion. It's not. There's lots and lots and lots of transactions that close with seller releasing possession on the day of closing. That's how transactions should be written going forward. Until the law changes, and Kaitlyn has said there's no foreseeable change to the law. So, bullet point, just don't let sellers retain possession after closing, at least on your advice, buyers. Kaitlyn said, that's probably not realistic advice, Annie, because there's still going to be buyers who say, I'm so desperate to purchase a seller's property, I trust the seller when the seller says I'm going to move out. So Kaitlyn, you said, if buyer is going to contemplate that, what should the broker's advice to buyers be?
Talk to an attorney that practices landlord-tenant law as quickly as you can. I think that at the end of the day, there may be some creative workarounds, but an attorney that has all of the relevant facts about how long the person intends to stay, what the monetary agreement might be and how it might be structured to encourage compliance, and also understanding the risks that you would be stepping into. If you're okay with those risks, well, as long as an attorney has advised you of those, they may be your risks or the buyer's risks that they're willing to take.
She's exactly right. If it's the lawyer, if it's the buyer's lawyer who gives the buyer advice that says it's okay to let the seller stay, well, I don't have a problem with that then. Why do I not have a problem with it? The buyer's still going to have the same problem, but you as a buyer broker are not going to have that problem. Remember that you are held to the standard of care of a lawyer when you prepare contractual documents between two third parties. And when you prepare the Form 65B rental agreement, giving the seller the right to occupy buyer's property after closing, you're held to the standard of care of a lawyer in preparation of that agreement. What did Kaitlyn just say? Kaitlyn just said that a lawyer who knows landlord-tenant law may be able to analyze all of the facts together, apply them to the law, and come up with some situation that makes buyers' risks somewhat less than the risk that Kaitlyn and I have described to you so far. There's no way to absolve the buyer from risk.
Nope, there is not.
There's no way to do that. But you're going to be held to the standard of care of a lawyer in preparing that 65B if you draft the agreement that lets seller retain possession of buyer's home. I'm not competent to draft that agreement in light of today's changed landlord-tenant law. I'm going to assume most buyer brokers aren't as well. You got to advise that buyer, and I mean advise that buyer to go talk to a competent landlord-tenant lawyer, put that advice in writing, provably deliver it, keep a copy of that advice in your folder. Okay, anything else that we need to say to scare these folks before we do our podcast?
No, I mean, other than the fact that the issue, how this comes up is when a buyer comes to me and says, my broker, basically gave me the thumbs up to sign this rent back agreement to the seller. And it turns out that I can't actually get the property back, but that's not what my broker told me. That should scare every broker, because the buyer is now correct that document isn't worth the paper that it's written on, and they are exposed to risk, and that should scare the broker just as much as the buyer.
Yeah, and so I know I'm going to get a lot of questions. Why do we have a Form 65B then, if we shouldn't be letting be letting sellers occupy the property after closing? Because the law doesn't say you can't. It doesn't say that the buyer can't allow the seller to occupy the property after closing. Form 65B serves the same purpose that it's always served. If buyer is going to allow seller to retain occupancy, Form 65B is a competent rental agreement. The advice that Kaitlyn and I the education that Kaitlyn and I are trying to give at the moment is that it is so extraordinarily risky in today's legal environment for landlords. it's so risky that buyers should not ever allow themselves to become landlords.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Please follow the link to watch the whole podcast or webcast. If you watch the whole webcast and podcast and you still have questions, then send an email to me, Legal Hotline at warealtor.org. Don't skip the webcast and come straight to me with questions that could have been answered by watching the webcast. Go watch the webcast. Bring questions to me, Legal Hotline at warealtor.org, if you've still got them, because goodness knows I'm probably going to have to call Kaitlyn to find the answers to the questions. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.